and welcome to another Giant Slayer TFT Top 5 Countdown video. Today our analysts will be listing the top 5 compositions for patch 10.25. The meta is in a fantastic place right now with a lot of different comps being viable in the mid game with clear late game transitions. There's a lot to cover today, so let's go ahead and jump on in. But before we get back to the video, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Kicking off our top 5, we have Duelists coming in as the number 5 composition. With the player damage changes and shop changes, the meta has a pretty clearly defined early, mid, and late game when it comes to comps and transitions. Duelists are one of the few builds that are unique and that you're going to commit to them early and stick with them all game. This comes with notable strengths and a few weaknesses, so let's cover those. The strengths of a Duelist composition is having a solid early game. Yasuo is the main reason as to why this is the case, since a chosen Yasuo can carry you practically through all of stage 2. From there, you can turn the advantage you got early game into a solid mid-game power spike by hitting both Yasuo 3 and 6 Duelists. But there is a downside to playing a reroll composition like Duelists. Mainly in that your late game is going to suffer as you'll likely get outscaled by other comps hitting their late game power spikes. That said, you should be in a strong enough position from that early and mid game to finish somewhere in the top 4, assuming you hit Yasuo 3 at a reasonable time. Duelists are a great composition to play when you have a strong opening for them, but keep in mind that they do fall off later, so don't hard commit to them unless your early game goes very well. Moving along, we have Divine Warwic coming in at number 4. Despite nerfs to both Divine and Warwick in 10.25, this composition is still going strong in the meta. It also benefits greatly from the fact that you can be flexible with it, as there's a few variations of the build. The main concern when playing it is finding Warwick, Shen, and Aurelia, as those 3 give you a solid base to work with 2 Divine and 2 Adept. Because of the flexibility, it can be difficult to know exactly what to play and when with Divine. There's a few paths you can take, with the most basic being 6 Divine, Adept, and Mystic. Look to give your Warwick Runins, Deathblade, and Quicksilver, and enjoy as he wrecks the enemy team. But due to the nerfs, this build is not as strong as it was, so keep in mind you may struggle if you aren't hitting upgrades. Other ways to use Divine and Warwick are built around using other hunters. Both Ashe and Aphelios greatly benefit from the attack speed buff Warwick gives, so you can play either of them with compositions centered around buffing them. Since Warwick is a necessary piece to those types of builds, it can be difficult to play consistently since he's likely to be contested. Overall, Divine isn't the best of the best like it was during 10.24, but it's still strong enough to consistently place well in ranked. The new kid on the block for 10.25 is coming in at number 3, Elderwoods. With buffs to both the Elderwood trait and champions in 10.25, we're seeing them return to the meta after being gone for quite some time. The buffs have made it so you can play Elderwood throughout each stage of the game successfully while being able to still transition into a strong late game comp. Early game, you can lean on Lulu, Maokai, and Hecarim to carry you, while the mid game shifts focus over to champions like Nunu and Veigar. Veigar is a solid carry throughout the game if you give him items like Gunblade or Hand of Justice. Ashe is also a valid choice in the mid game as a carry, while also being great in the late game. Lastly, you have 2 solid legendaries that can easily fit into your comp with Set and Ezreal. Because Elderwoods can rely on either Veigar or Ashe to carry, it allows you to adapt to what the game gives you in both champions and items. If you find yourself with good Veigar items, you can look to play for him 6 Elderwood and 3 Mage. Ashe, on the other hand, can be played with either 6 Elderwoods or Brawlers. You just have to make sure you have at least 3 Elderwoods. And in the late game, we already know that Ezreal is a solid champion, but the big surprise of 10.25 is Set. Set would often cast his ability and not end up doing full damage, or in some cases, any additional damage at all, because his main target was affected by a status such as being untargetable or unstoppable. With the bug fix, he does far more consistent damage and thus is a reliable late game champion that easily fits into any Elderwood comp. We definitely recommend playing around with different variations of Elderwood, as there's a lot that you can do with them. With a lot of emphasis on flexibility for the current meta, it should be no surprise that the number 2 composition on today's list is Dusk. Dusk is easily one of the most flexible compositions since the trait itself provides at least some bonus spell power to the whole team. This opens up the door to just splashing 2 Dusk or fully committing and going 6. Most often, you're going to end up with 4 Dusk since it's easy to obtain and has a strong carry with Riven. Since 4 Dusk can require as little as 3 champions, you can really play whatever you want with it, whether that's playing Keepers, Cultists, or simply adding in a bunch of legendary champions. Another reason why it's such a flexible composition is turning a champion into a Dusk with a spatula can be quite effective. Even champions like Jhin, which are based around physical damage, get a huge boost from the spell power since it affects all abilities. That means anytime you have a spatula, you have even more options than you normally would. Granted, you won't always have games where you get a spatula, but Dusk can easily transition, so whenever you have a spat, you can easily switch over to it. Dusk also has a solid late game presence thanks to Riven, Cassiopeia, and to a lesser extent, Lilia. Plus, you have a lot of room to slot in other synergies and champions, so you can easily transition towards playing mostly legendaries with Dusk. Basically, if you're unsure what to play once you're in the mid game, you can always turn towards some type of Dusk build and likely do well. And now for our number one composition of the current meta in patch 10.25, we have legendaries. Okay, so this isn't exactly a composition, it's more or less a state of the game once you've hit level 8 and 9. While there are definitive builds you can play in the mid game, for the most part, once you hit the late game, you're going to be aiming to play 5-cost champions. In fact, you can basically transition out of whatever build you were playing and just throw in a bunch of 5-cost champions and have a strong board. The main reason why this is a viable strategy is twofold. One is the meta is no longer hit level 7 and roll to 0. Getting to level 8 is overall better to do, so more players are getting there, which happens early into stage 5. While the chances for a legendary at level 8 aren't great, it's high enough that you can usually find a few of them during your rolls and generally 2-star at least one of them in most games. The other reason as to why playing for legendaries is viable is simply due to the fact that, well, 5-cost champions are really good in set 4. Almost all of them bring something useful, whether that's dealing a boatload of damage like Kayn or having a revive spell like Zillion. And they can all be played without really needing to focus on their synergies, though in some cases it's even more of a reason to play them like Yone with Adept. What all this boils down to is whichever way you play the mid game, you always have a direction to transition towards in the late game with legendary champions. Alright, that's it for our top 5 comps for the current 10.25 meta. But we're not done yet, as we have a few honorable mentions to go over, of which there's quite a few as the meta is quite diverse. First up, we have Moonlights. Moonlight can focus on either Diana 4 as the carry or Aphelios. Aphelios doesn't necessarily need to be level 4 to carry, but it is ideal to do so. Either way, you need to find a Moonlight chosen, as it helps a lot in hitting an early power spike. Diana as a carry should be familiar enough, but Aphelios has been sneaking his way back into the meta. With bug fixes and the Warwick change, it's a viable option to once again use Aphelios as a main carry. Basically, he gets a lot of attack speed from Warwick and Rageblade, plus a lot of damage from Hunter procs. Overall, the build is still being sorted out, but definitely keep an eye out for it moving forward in the meta. Next, we have Warlords. Warlords can be an amazing mid-game composition centered around 6 Warlords, but they do fall off late game unless you're fully committing to them with either a Katarina 3 or 9 Warlords. Both of those can be difficult to do consistently, which is why Warlords is generally a better stepping stone for the mid-game to transition into a different late-game build. That said, Katarina is a devastating carry during the mid-game, especially with items like Hextech Gunblade or Hand of Justice. Early game is also another strength for Warlords if you find a chosen Warlord, which is made even better by the fact that you can gain a few extra stacks of the trait by playing Warlord units during the PvE rounds. So while this composition isn't the best when it comes to the late game, it's certainly a viable option early on with a particularly large power spike in the mid game. Another honorable mention we have is Zed. Zed with ninjas has fallen down a bit in priority for this meta, but it still holds its own, especially during stage 3, where you can often net yourself a large win streak by hitting a chosen Zed. Later on in the game, the build can suffer, though hitting Zed 3 definitely helps it do better. That said, the reason why Zed doesn't do as well anymore is that it does get outscaled late game unless you're getting high rolled a lot. But if you have a good mid game, especially during stage 3, and can hit Zed 3, it's certainly possible to finish in the top 4, if not the top 2. And we have our last honorable mention to talk about, Sharpshooters. Sharpshooters, at least 6 Sharpshooters, isn't as common as it was in the past. Mainly this is due to the changes that made Jinx a lot less of a reliable carry. Jhin is still strong, but the issue with Jhin is that he's contested since he can be slotted into a lot of different builds as a carry. The reason we're highlighting Sharpshooters is that Vayne 3 is doing surprisingly well as a viable carry. This does require a bit of luck as you need a chosen Vayne, but if you find yourself with one, then you can slow roll at level 5 to hit Vayne 3. From there, you can either play for 6 Sharpshooters or have a more well-rounded build with 4. Vayne can do a lot of damage at tier 3 since her passive does bonus true damage. You give her a Runins and a bit of attack speed, she does equal damage to a lot of other late game carries, if not more, since a portion of her damage is true damage. That all said, we want to caution that this build is not a build that you can easily force, so we only recommend playing it when you're presented with a really good opening for it. That's all for today's video, folks. While the late game is definitely all about 5-cost champions, the overall meta is in a healthy and well-balanced state. There's even more variations and potential builds than we were able to talk about today, so we recommend trying out different comps and see what works best for you. Let us know in the comment section below what you've been enjoying and if we missed any that you think deserve to be on the list. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.